Hey there, Independent Scientologists. Discover a new perspective to your bridge by visiting ao-gp.org. Get in session with remote auditing using the Theta Meter. Are you curious about where you stand? Head on over to ao-gp.org now and take our free personality test. Join the growing group of independent Scientologists today.
Hi, welcome to another Scientology Outside of the Church podcast brought to you by the Advanced Org of the Great Plains. This is Season 8, Episode 8, Remote Viewing, What Happened to Scientology, the Corporate Church of Scientology. Part 2, and this takes us back, and we're going to jump right in it. I'm here with Scientology Girl. How are you, Scientology Girl?
I'm very well, thanks.
So we're going to go and head on back to 1960, as you are probably familiar if you listened to Episode 1. We ended off on the 18th of December. The Garden News, this is 1959, publishes a story, Plants Do Worry and Feel Pain. And this is 1959, and just a couple of weeks ago, it was admitted in many of the scientific journals, botanical scientific journals, that plants can see.
Yeah, and
They can hear and feel.
Sentient.
Yeah, in 2024. And you see all this stuff on the internet about LRH and how crazy he is, and putting an E-meter on tomatoes and things like that.
Those, all those people that commented, I think, were people of very low IQs, because it is just obvious.
Yeah.
If something survives, if something has theta in, obviously it,
Yeah.
like,
It's manifest.
right.
Manifest. So this brings us up to 1961, Monday, 17th of April. Martin Ebon, administrative assistant of the Parapsychology Association in New York and on staff with the U.S. Information Agency in Washington, D.C., giving a brief on telepathy to a top intelligence agency, is a specialist in tracking and examining the nature and direction of Russian and Soviet security services. That leads us to 25 July 1961. LRH goes from St. Hill, England to Cape Finisterre, Spain for about 10 days and purchases a ship that is 106 feet long. I remember mentioning this on the briefing course, with an 18-foot beam and sleeps about 22 people. He says that purchase of the ship is, quote unquote, part of an operation he is conducting from St. Hill. Note, this event is the earliest indication of Hubbard's creation in Spain of the confidential Sea Project, later to be called the Sea Org, as far back as 1961. Which he establishes to protect and deliver the confidential upper levels of Scientology. This is the first ship that he purchased. The Sea Project or Sea Org will not be made known publicly for several years. Ron writes that the oldest yacht in the Sea Org is the Enchanter. This is the boat that he got on the 20th of July, 1961. Tuesday, 1st August, 1961, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, which we mentioned in the last podcast, is created in the Department of Defense. Note, after the 1971-72 creation of the CIA initiated remote viewing program, its administration later gets transferred, or at least in part, to the DIA as one of action of the remote viewing shell game of secrecy that goes on for decades. So they move things around so you can't find them, and this is that, and that is this, and typical Earth black ops politics. 1962 in July. A book published in the Soviet Union, Biological Radio Communication, claims experimental confirmation of the fact that communication between two people separated by long distances can be carried out through water, over air, and across a metal barrier by means of cerebral radiation in the course of thinking, and without conventional communication facilities. So the Soviets in 1962 were working on this very thing, and this is why the U.S. government, the Black Ops, CIA, DOD, wanted what LRH was developing.
Right.
Now, that brings us to 1963. This is where it starts to get hairy. The CIA organizes Robert Mullen, public relations firm, as a CIA front company for use mainly in providing CIA cover overseas. Mullen has several overseas branches for its CIA front operations and an office in Washington, D.C. One of its branches in Europe is staffed, run, and paid for by the CIA. Note, Howard Hunt, which we mentioned in the last not the Howard Hunt of the Spruce Goose, this is a different Howard Hunt, will retire from the CIA and go to work for Mullen on the 1st of May, 1970, about 7 years from now. At the time of his purported retirement, Hunt will be CIA's chief Euro CA. Not sure what that means, but he's the head guy for Europe, is the way it looks. The CIA's Richard Helms attempted to defend the CIA drug operations like Midnight Climax by telling CIA Inspector John Ehrman that such testing had been necessary to keep up with the Soviets. Well, because they're doing it, we've got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Typical.
Yeah.
Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. This is way back when. Deputy Marshals, 4 January 1963, and the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. raid the Scientology headquarters in Washington, D.C., and seize 100 meters, along with Scientology publications on the grounds that the e-meters are, quote-unquote, misbranded. Misbranded.
Wow.
Yeah, as far back as 63. So they wanted some for their own use, obviously.
Yeah.
64, Daniel Ellsberg is granted a unique security clearance giving him unprecedented access to data and studies in all agencies, as well as several special clearances, quote-unquote, including, quote, very high-level access to all our secrets in the State and Defense Departments of the CIA. So this guy needed in, and they were starting something.
Right.
Circa 1964, November, Richard Helms, which I remember from when I was a kid, director of the CIA and father of MK-Ultra, contradicts himself on the need to, quote, keep up with the Soviets, unquote, telling the Warren Commission, the very same Warren Commission that signed off on how JFK was killed, I might add, that, quote, Soviet research has consistently lagged 5 years behind Western research. Right. Early January 1965, LRH and Mary Sue Hubbard leave St. Hill in England and travel to Spain, going first to the Canary Islands, a province of Spain off the coast of Morocco. His research into the upper levels of Scientology is now confidential, and while in Spain and the Canary Islands, he lays the groundwork for establishing confidential bases in Spain to deliver the upper levels. In Spain, they returned to St. Hill mid-February 1965. That brings us to 17 May 1965. About 6 months later, 5-6 months later, psychiatrist Jose Delgado gives a mind control demonstration in all places, Spain. He presses a button, and this is on a bull. He presses a button on a radio transmitter, and the bull breaks to a halt. He presses another button, and the bull turns to the right and trots away, obeying commands being delivered through radio signals to brain regions in which fine wires had been planted the day before. Monday, 14 June 1965, LRH issues Politics Freedom From in executive directive form, declaring Scientology to be non-political and non-ideological, and declaring it, quote, free of any political connection or allegiance of any kind whatsoever.
Interesting.
Yeah, he says the reason for the declaration is the continuing efforts of the U.S. government to, quote, to seize Scientology in the United States, unquote. In closing, he says, Scientologists may be members of any political group on this planet without restraint only so long as these individuals or that group do not attempt to seize Scientology for their own warlike ends and so make it unworkable or distasteful by invidious connection. One of my favorite policies. Tuesday, 29 June 1965, 3 years before I was born, L. Ron Hubbard tells a group of Scientology students in a lecture at St. Hill in England that he has recently returned from Washington, D.C., where IRS and factions of the U.S. government have been trying to seize Scientology in the United States, quote unquote, and that he has told them an emphatic no. I remember that lecture as well. So a lot going on in 65. Now, this brings us to July 1965. E. Howard Hunt converts from CIA employee to CIA contract status and is sent by Richard Helms on a secret mission to Madrid, Spain. The Canary Islands, where L. Ron Hubbard has recently begun to establish a base for upper-level Scientology research, is a province of Spain at the time. In a meeting with CIA's William Colby, it is arranged that Daniel Ellsberg will be traveling to Vietnam with E. Howard Hunt's longtime associate, Lucien Conant, on a team headed up by 20-year CIA veteran Edward Lansdale. Now, these 4 locations in Spain. Cape Finisterre is where Hubbard bought the first ship. Madrid is where E. Howard Hunt's base for top secret mission is. Alicante was the first land-based advanced org with OT levels. The Canary Islands is where LRH set up the Sea Org and does confidential research. And then in Tangier, Morocco, LRH disappeared on the 28th of May, 1972 with a green beret, quote-unquote, bodyguard. More on that later. Friday, the 3rd of September, 1965. LRH inaugurates a confidential clearing course available only at St. Hill in East Grinstead, Sussex, England. Monday, 11 October, Moscow's A.S. Popov Scientific Technical Society for Radio Engineering, Electronics, and Communication establishes a laboratory for bioinformation to conduct laboratory-controlled telepathic experiments. Note also referred to as Soviet Laboratory for Bioelectronics and Laboratory for Biocommunications.
So does that have something to do with the clearing course?
No.
It's just put together in a timeline, basically.
Yeah,
the story unfolds later or something.
Yeah, the clearing course is on the clearing course, and OT2 is where you use telepathy.
Okay.
In solo auditing. I can say that.
Yeah.
11 October 1965, Moscow's... Oh, I just read that one. Sunday, 17 October 1965, Daniel Ellsberg has arrived in Vietnam with CIA's Edward Lansdale, often misspelled in another way, and Lucian Conan, and is put in touch with John Paul Van. Through Van, Ellsberg meets reporter Neil Sheehan. For about 6 weeks, Van drives Ellsberg around to every province capital in 3 corps, the 11 provinces that include Saigon. Note, Neil Sheehan will later publish secret documents given to him by Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, which I'm sure some of our listeners have heard of before. Now, on Tuesday, 14 December 1965, Stephen I. Abrams, director of the Parapsychological Laboratory at Oxford University, England, working under the auspices of the CIA's MK Ultra, prepares a review article entitled Extrasensory Perception. It says ESP has been demonstrated but is not understood or controllable. Now, Tuesday, 28 December 1965, 65 was a busy year for all of this, LRH issues a Scientology policy that forbids anyone connected to a suppressive group from being allowed onto the confidential Scientology upper levels unless and until the group is permanently disbanded. Suppressive groups, quote-unquote, are defined as those that seek to destroy Scientology or specialize in, quote, injuring or killing people or damaging their cases, unquote, or that, quote, advocate the suppression of mankind, which all of this sounds like they're up to no good.
Right.
They include police spy organizations and government spy organizations, unquote, such as the CIA, IRS, FBI, National Security Agency, NSA, Department of Justice, DOJ, quote, or any other federal agency in any country, unquote. Okay, so he's become aware of this and says, look, you guys need to look into this. So that brings us to 1966. CIA contractor, and this is 2 February 1966, Cleve Baxter connects plants to polygraph and gets reactions on the machines when the plants are threatened or harmed. No, these are also identical to what LRH did in 1959. Right. So they're like, I got an idea. Yeah, let's try this.
That's a great idea. It's totally original.
6 years later, what a comm lag.
Right.
March 1966, Daniel Ellsberg is working in Vietnam in conjunction with the CIA's intelligence coordination and exploitation operations. Forerunner of the Phoenix Project, quote, on Hamlet pacification, a euphemism for, among other things, kidnapping, brutal interrogations, and assassinations in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam had already gotten going after Kennedy was killed, and this is going on hot and heavy by that time. Thursday, the 7th of April, 1966, Daniel Ellsberg is in a meeting in Vietnam with his old friend Rand, from the Rand Corporation, CIA veteran and National Security Council member Robert Comer, At the time, Ellsberg is involved with Lucian Conan and John Paul Vann, one of the Green Berets of the various CIA pacification programs. Note, Preston later will enroll in Scientology and will be described by some sources as having become the bodyguard of L. Ron Hubbard when Hubbard disappears in Morocco. And we'll get more into that in 72. Around July 1966, this whole web is kind of closing in a bit. Special Department Number 8 is established at the Institute of Automation and Electrometry. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. Near Novosibirsk, Siberia. Science City is what it's called. The building that houses the department can only be entered if one knows the code, changed each week, that opens the main doors locked. The Number 8 quote-unquote operation is devoted to experiments and information transmission by bioengineeric means. About 60 researchers have been brought to the facility from other parts of Russia.
That was in 66.
66. That's 57 years ago. Where are they at now?
Yeah.
Technologically speaking. Saturday, 9 July 1966, the Moscow Daily in Pravda reports on long-distance telepathy experiments conducted by the Moscow Laboratory of Bioinformation using Yuri Kamensky and Karl Nikolaev. The experiments are reported to have, quote, demonstrated the reality of the phenomenon and produced valuable data, both positive and negative, which pointed up the need for continued research. Now, Friday, 29 July 1966, you start connecting the dots here. You see this. The IRS sends a letter to the senior Scientology organization, Church of Scientology of California, recommending revocation of tax exemption. Okay, so this tells me that what happened is they're like, oh, there's some validity to this information Hubbard has come up with. We need to start putting the screws to this guy because he's got information we find as a threat, and we're the only ones that want it. This is 1966. Now, Sunday, 14 August 1966, the confidential materials for the first operating Thetan level, OT1, are released by LRH, qualified Scientologists, on 14 August 1966. The level is called OT1. So this is 2 weeks. The IRS sends a letter to the church 2 weeks before LRH issues the first OT level for the first time. So I find that very curious that they're trying to put the screws to things.
Screws to things?
Yeah, they're trying to cause trouble when he's researching the OT levels within 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks of him releasing OT1. Now, 16 August 1966, LRH issues a Scientology policy letter. Tuesday, 16 August 1966, L. Ron Hubbard issues a Scientology policy letter called Clearing Course Security, with instructions on how to handle reports of anyone being, quote, a potential security risk, unquote, with confidential upper-level materials. He knew we needed to be watched. On the 1st of September 1966, about 2 weeks later, LRH resigns from all directorships and running of Scientology organizations. At about the same time, he releases a qualified Scientologist the confidential materials of, quote, Operating Thetan Level 2, or OT2.
I did not know he resigned.
Mm-hmm. All directorships and running of Scientology organizations as far back as 1966.
Why?
Because he did not, if they came after him, he wanted them to come after him, not the organization. So it's that way. Otherwise, he can't be tied. So he made it public.
But he didn't technically resign if he was still writing policies and that sort of thing, right?
Well, it's just giving them to them in a suggestive way. Oh. Yeah. So you can submit something and donate it. See. So that brings us to things were getting hot and heavy by the latter part of 1966. By 21 September 1966, the CIA's E. Howard Hunt returns to the Washington, D.C. area from a highly secret assignment he has been on in Spain for a little over a year. And this is where things get hectic. Wednesday, 21 September 1966, the CIA's E. Howard Hunt returns to the Washington, D.C. area from a highly secret assignment he has been on in Spain for a little over a year. Hunt supposedly has been on a quote-unquote contract basis with the CIA rather than an employee of the CIA since leaving for Spain, but a CIA document of 21 September sent to the CIA's central cover staff through the Office of Security refers to Hunt as this employee. More on this in 1970. Wednesday, 5 October, about 2 weeks later, He, Howard Hunt, arrives in D.C. Daniel Ellsberg leaves Vietnam and flies to Washington, D.C., then turns around almost immediately and makes a one-week trip back to Vietnam, flying nonstop on the plane of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Ellsberg is in contact again with CIA's Robert Comer. So he either went and got some documents or got somebody else and then brought them back to Vietnam.
Right.
Wednesday, 12 October, about a week later, 1966, Daniel Ellsberg flies back from Vietnam to Washington, D.C. again, nonstop on McNamara's plane again. With them is CIA's Robert Comer. Thursday, 10 November, about a month later, LRH has created the SEED Project and confidential programs for Scientology clears and OTs to carry out. So in Scientology, LRH is ramping things up as these guys are ramping things up in tandem. I find that very interesting, not in a bad way, but I find it very interesting. Tuesday, 29 November 1966, about 3 weeks later, LRH gives a lecture to St. Hills Special Briefing Course, OT and Clear Defined. Great lecture. Date code 6611, lecture code St. Hills Special 82. That is incorrect. It is not the 82nd lecture in the St. Hills Special Briefing Course. 1967, this is where Ingo Swann comes in. Ingo Swann begins to take Scientology services. At about the same time, Swann tendered his 2-year notice for resignation from his permanent contract with the United Nations Secretariat in New York, the UN of all places. The National Security Agency's Hal Puthoff enrolls in Scientology services. How this happened, I'll never know. Note, Puthoff will somehow get past or around the Hubbard injunction against members of a suppressive group, being allowed access to the upper levels of Scientology, and by 1971, Puthoff will have attained the highest level, OT7. I think somebody got paid off, personally. More on this in 1971. Back to the IRS, July 1967, the IRS revokes the tax exemption of the senior Scientology organization, Church of Scientology of California, like it threatened it would do, which it has had since January 1957. So if they can't get them one way, they're going to try and get them another. Wednesday, 10 January 1968, LRH reissues Politics Freedom From, which we mentioned earlier, from 14 June 1965, this time as a broad public issue, declaring Scientology to be non-political and non-ideological, and declaring it, quote, free of any political connection or allegiance of any kind whatever. He says the reason for the declaration is a continuing effort of the U.S. government to seize Scientology in the United States, which it sounds like they were trying to do.
Right.
February 68, American intelligence and analysts, quote unquote, begin noticing, quote, noticing a Soviet secret police KGB trend indicating serious interest in what is called parapsychology in the West, quote unquote. The first Scientology advanced organization is started on the Scientology flagship Royal Scotsman, later renamed the Apollo, for the delivery of the confidential upper levels. The location is highly confidential. Now, I might also add that, and it isn't in this, prior to this, the United Kingdom would not renew LRH's visa. And even though he owned St. Hill in full, bought, sold, paid for, he had to leave the country and not come back. He never entered the United Kingdom again that anybody knows of because he couldn't get in the country.
Wow.
And that is why he bought the Apollo, is he needed some other place, private.
Residence.
Yeah, residence and everything. So he owns this nice home and everything in the countryside in East Grinstead. Can't even get to it or live there. Yeah. Putting a stop to the St. Hill Special Briefing Course. Yeah. Yeah. And that's not mentioned in this, and it should be.
Yeah.
All right. We're getting to March 1968. Daniel Ellsberg is working at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica, California. He begins having regular meetings with Beverly Hills psychiatrist Louis J. Fielding. Go figure, psychiatrist. Former staff psychiatrist of the Veterans Administration when LRH was connected with the VA there. Ellsberg purportedly is a Fielding patient. So, wow. Yeah. So Tuesday, 4 March 1969, on a trip to the Rand office in D.C., Daniel Ellsberg is given a copy of the top secret study that will become known as the Pentagon Papers, quote unquote, for him to carry with him to the Rand office in Santa Monica, California, where he works. April 69, Ingo Swann Ingo Swann's employment on a permanent contract, quote unquote, with United Nations Secretariat in New York comes to an end. Tuesday, 30 September 1969, Daniel Ellsberg, quote, decides to release the Pentagon Papers, unquote, purportedly because he reads in the newspaper that all charges have been dropped against several Green Berets who had been charged with a murder in Vietnam. Now, it's important to note the kind of ops the Green Berets had been charged with were what Ellsberg himself had been immersed in while in Vietnam, including time spent with his, quote, good friend Robert Comer, who headed CIA's Phoenix project of kidnappings and assassinations. Jeez.
They're just all involved with so many things.
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, this is low-tone, dark stuff.
Yeah.
Tuesday, 16 September 1969, the Scientology Guardian's Office order says that double agents are being infiltrated into Scientology staffs and urges the use of any means to detect such infiltration. So LRH knew something was up and some good people had caught on to this. December 1969, G. Gordon Liddy is granted special clearances by the CIA. Now, G. Gordon Liddy also comes up with a few years later in the Watergate scandal and all of this stuff. All this stuff is tied in together. And I remember this in the news when I was a kid. It was a big deal. Now, we are now at 1970. Here's where it gets interesting. Even more interesting, and where the IRS comes in. January 1970, Meade Emery, remember this name, folks, Meade Emery, is legislation attorney for the Joint Committee on Taxation of the U.S. Congress. Note that Meade has ties to the law firm Gall, Lane, Powell, and Kilcullen in Washington, D.C. Emery will later be assistant to the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, then secretly will be the architect of several wills attributed to LRH and of the restructuring of all Scientology corporations, turning control of all Scientology materials over to non-Scientology tax attorneys appointed for life to this day in 2024. More on this later. This is what happened to Scientology and why.
I wish there was like a mind map of all this stuff. You know,
it really would be great to do,
because it's hard to remember all these people and things.
Yeah, all the interweavings and things, and it's really a lot to take in.
It is,
and that's why we're doing this.
Yeah,
but yeah, mind map would be really great.
We said this was only gonna be a part 2, but I think there's
gonna be a part 3.
Few parts.
Yeah. Now, we're going to jump to 22 February 1970, and this is an important figure in Scientology. Yvonne Gilliam would later be Yvonne Gilliam Jensch and Mary Heber Jensch, the president of the Church of Scientology later on in the 70s. One of the earliest Sea Org members has been commanding officer of the Scientology Advanced Organization in Los Angeles. LRH gives her a mission to set up a Scientology organization called Celebrity Center in Los Angeles, which I'm sure our listeners have heard of, with the purpose of, quote, revitalization of the arts, unquote. She rents an old redwood and brick warehouse near downtown Los Angeles and begins delivering basic Scientology services to people in the arts, sports, entertainment, and government. She also knows, wait for it, Ingo Swann. And he is instrumental in helping her get Celebrity Center started. Imagine that. The center also has an art gallery, a performance theater, and classes in everything from ballet to fencing to fine arts and crafts like poetry and pottery and leatherwork. And I assure you, they don't do that today at CC in Los Angeles at all. And it's a shame that they don't. Friday, 10 April 1970, Richard Helms has rubber-stamped E. Howard Hunt's early retirement, quote unquote, has written a letter to Robert Mullen on behalf of Hunt, urging Mullen to hire him. Mullen is head of a CIA-created public relations firm in Washington, D.C., and has, quote, cooperated, unquote, with the CIA in the past. One of Mullen's offices in Stockholm, Sweden, is staffed, run, and paid for by CIA, unquote. Also at the Mullen firm is Douglas Caddy. Monday, 13 April 1970, Daniel Ellsberg quits the Rand Corporation of California, flies to Boston, and signs a contract with MIT. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the biggest technological colleges in the world. He remains, though, a consultant for RAND. Friday, 1 May 1970, E. Howard Hunt ostensibly retires from the CIA. He goes to work for Mullen in D.C. Note, by this time, up to 8 people at the Mullen Company have been, quote, cleared and made witting of agency ties, mainly in providing CIA cover overseas. Sometime shortly after arriving, Hunt is told by Robert Mullen that Mullen is planning to retire before long and that Douglas Caddy has been selected to run the CIA front company along with Hunt and an unnamed other person after Mullen's retirement. Tuesday, 5 May 1970, Daniel Ellsberg flies to Washington, D.C. and is there for 3 days, flies to St. Louis for a day, then flies back to D.C. Wednesday, 13 May 1970, Daniel Ellsberg testifies before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings, Senator Fulbright chairing. Thursday, 28 May 1970, a CIA covert security approval is requested under Project QK Enchant for Howard E. Hunt. August 1970, just 4 months after E. Howard Hunt, James McCord, quote-unquote, retires from the CIA. September 1970, Daniel Ellsberg stops seeing Beverly Hills psychiatrist Louis Fielding. Note Ellsberg had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts months before. And this is back in April 1970, a few months before. Sunday, 20 November 1970, LRH releases Original OT7, the highest level in Scientology to the advanced organizations around the world. November 1970, Douglas Caddy leaves the Mullen firm to work for Gall, Lane, Powell, and Kilcullen, where tax and probate attorney Meade Emery is connected. E. Howard Hunt becomes a quote-unquote client of Caddy and of Gall, Lane, Powell, and Kilcullen. Caddy consults with Hunt regarding probate and other matters. They were planning in 1970 to take over Scientology and change LRH's wills because they knew they needed this data. Now, this all ties together in a neat little bow later on.
I was going to ask, I'm so curious because you've read it. I haven't.
Movie. Yeah, it would make a great movie.
And do they have a summary at the end?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it did. Yeah, it all roads
together.
Yeah, all roads lead to why Scientology has the ill repute that it does, and it's not for the reasons that anybody thinks. Yeah. That's why we're doing it.
Well, I think we probably know why those reasons are.
Yeah, I think with anybody with an IQ, to control people. Mm-hmm. So this leads us to G. Gordon Liddy is approached by Robert Mardian, asking Liddy to take a position that Mardian describes as super confidential. Okay, this is November 1970. Okay, and we're gonna just broach into 1971 and end the podcast for now. But January 1971, the NSA's Hal Puthoff somehow has gotten past LRH's prohibition against government spy agency personnel being allowed access to upper-level Scientology and has progressed up to Original OT7, the highest level available. He writes a success story for a Scientology publication about having completed OT7, saying that on a weekend he had stood outside a locked building and remotely viewed information he wanted from a building directory that he couldn't physically read from the doorway, then verified later, when the building was open, that what he had viewed remotely had been accurate. Note, according to Scientology's The Auditor magazine, special issue March 1971, by that date, there are only 2,773 Scientology clears in the world at that time. Being clear is a prerequisite to the OT levels. Even if 10% had gone all the way up through the higher levels by this date, Puthoff would have be among only about 300 OT7s in the world, but yet he pulled it off in that short period of time. Clearly, they wanted the data.
Yeah.
So we're going to end this podcast for part 2 at January 1971. February 1971 will be coming up. We're going to try and pop up the next iteration of this over the weekend to get it out next Monday. We hope you've enjoyed this, and boy, it's a lot to keep track of, but you will be shocked at where this all ends up and what has happened to Scientology, the church, and the subject to a certain degree, and why we are independent Scientologists. It's very, very important. And we really appreciate you sticking with us through this. Hopefully we'll have a mind map for this in the next 6 months with the help of AI. Scientology girl, have any closing statements?
Just one, I was thinking about this whole thing, and I do apologize for using a psychological term, but the way these people are behaving and stuff, it's almost a little codependent, because the hallmark of a codependent is that they try and control others for, because they dare not look at themselves. They prefer to look at others and help fix others and control others and everything like that. Exactly. It's not necessarily that these people want to just destroy everyone, because then we'd all be dead. There's enough nuclear warheads on the planet. It's the control factor, and obviously they've got to keep us around, and maybe there's some care that gets taken, when it comes to true codependency, but it's pretty similar to me. And in saying that, it's just, it's really psycho. And at the bottom of the whole thing is, the only way you can really be powerful is to control yourself. That's just it. And they don't see that.
No. So true. Again, we'll see you soon. We're going to try and get out part 3 over the weekend and have it out on Monday. Hopefully we'll have this out by U.S. Friday evening on the 31st of May. Thanks for sticking with us. Namaste, and we love you.